Welcome to Sherlock Shadow Channel, where every story hides a secret. Grab your coffee, sit back, and dive into a world of twists and turns. Tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Hercule Poirot and the Veil That Covered a Scream. Chapter 1. The Blue Veil of Dawn. The fog had not yet fully lifted when the London to Bath Express train gently pulled into the private Hartwell Manor station. The landscape, suffused with a damp, pale stillness, seemed to hold its breath, as if the day itself feared to begin. On the stone platform, a single porter waited stiffly, his arms crossed behind his back, his eyes fixed on the first-class carriage, where a figure was already descending slowly but steadily. Lady Eugenia Carstairs. She was dressed in a silvery grey that was as sober as it was elegant, with a dark blue veil partially covering her face. Her bearing was unmistakable, nobility hardened by the years, a sharp gaze and that air of rigidity that only the British aristocracy could cultivate naturally. Behind her, a young lady descended with a frightened expression and uncertain movements. It was her niece, Judith Carstairs, the only living heir of the late Sir Alaric Carstairs. In the nearby hills, Hartwell Manor stood like a solid shadow among the trees. Made of greyish stone, square turrets, and Gothic-style glass windows, it was the kind of place where secrets echoed within the walls. It had been closed for nearly a decade since the patriarch's death, and now it was reopening its doors for an unusual reason: the reading of Sir Alaric's new will, recently discovered by a lawyer during a routine inventory. But for those who were in the house that morning, surprises weren't the only thing in store. In the main parlour, the clocks were striking 9 when the rest of the summons arrived. Mr. Ambrose Merriweather, a soft-faced notary public with oval glasses, was arranging his papers on the mahogany table with nervous hands. Miss Marjorie Liddell, Judith's retired governess, stood at a distance, a cup of tea in her trembling hands. Colonel Desmond Blake, the deceased's former business partner, stood near the fireplace, absent-mindedly tapping his cane. Beside him, the young actress Lucille March put on a silent show of studied indifference, observing everything with almond-shaped eyes filled with restrained disdain. It was then that the scream rang out. Sharp, close, human. It came from the East Wing, where the rooms had been locked since Sir Alaric's death. Everyone turned at once. Judith covered her mouth with her hand. Lady Eugenia didn't move, but her lips formed a tense line. A few seconds later, the butler, Bentley, appeared in the doorway. His pale face spoke volumes before he even spoke a word. Miss Liddell, in the music room. She's dead. Despite the restrained chaos that followed, there were no tears, only anxious glances and silence. The body was found next to the piano, Judith's blue veil carefully spread over her chest, as if someone had wanted to delicately cover her, or silence a scream. But no one remembered that Judith had already worn the veil. In fact, she was still looking for it. Mr. Merriweather, pale as the paper he held, was the first to articulate the question that everyone was avoiding. But how? How can this be possible? We were just talking to her an hour ago. Colonel Blake stepped forward. Maybe it was a heart attack, the scare this morning, the stress over the will. And the veil? Lucille March asked without moving a muscle. Who covered her with that? No one's mentioned it until now. No one responded. Bentley left the room for a moment and returned with a white card between his fingers, visibly disturbed. This came by express courier, addressed to Lady Carstairs, but the sender is even stranger. He held out the card. Lady Eugenie read it coldly. A line written in perfect, tiny handwriting read, "I'm arriving tonight. Please prepare a room near the library. Signed, Hercule Poirot." For some of those present, the name was barely familiar. For others, like Lady Eugenie, it evoked poignant memories of the past. Poirot had investigated a scandal involving Alaric's younger brother years ago, uncovering a web of fraud and blackmail that nearly ruined the Carstairs family. He wasn't welcome, but he wasn't someone to be turned away either. And now he came of his own free will. Lucille March, crossing her arms with forced elegance, was the first to say what everyone was thinking. And why would the great detective come now? Did someone call him? Or did he just know there was something worth solving? No one answered. But deep down, everyone knew the veil wasn't an accident, and that the scream, if anyone had actually heard it, still hung in the air, covered by a thin cloth, like a badly buried secret. That evening, when the hackney carriage pulled up to the main entrance of Hartwell Manor, a short figure with a neatly trimmed moustache and stiff hat stepped out. With a precise stride, his dark coat was unblemished. He carried a cane that looked more like an ornament than a tool. He surveyed the house like someone watching a play before the curtain rises. "Good. A crime has undoubtedly been committed here, which cries out for justice," murmured Hercule Poirot. And he entered. Chapter 2. A Circle of Shadows. Rain began to fall silently on the windows of Hartwell Manor as Hercule Poirot was led into the hall by the butler, Bentley. The dull echo of his footsteps mingled with the steady ticking of the large grandfather clock, which seemed to mark not only the hours but also the invisible tensions in the house. A heavy silence dominated the atmosphere, not the silence of rest, but the silence that arises when thoughts have not yet been spoken. Poirot placed his hat on the hall table with a gesture of almost artistic precision. Then he turned to Bentley with an inquisitive look. "Tell me, sir, are all the occupants of the house still present?" "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. No one has left Hartwell since this morning. Lady Carstairs insisted on it. Sensitive, very sensitive." "Please take me to her," said Poirot, without raising his voice, but with unquestionable firmness. Bentley led him to the conservatory, a room decorated with hunting tapestries, austere armchairs, and a window overlooking the abandoned greenhouse. Lady Eugenie sat in a high-backed armchair, sipping tea as if nothing could upset her. Her figure seemed carved in stone. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, without rising, "I must confess I didn't expect to see you, nor had I called for you. No, madame, but sometimes duty calls." Poirot smiled gently, moving closer. "And when a veil appears over a dead woman, one can't help feeling that a strange story is afoot." Lady Eugenia looked at him for a long time. "How did you find out about the veil?" "Let's just say certain connections informed me of legal developments surrounding your late husband's will, and the reopening of this house. And then a name popped up, Carstairs. Not an ordinary one. I felt a pang of unease. I came, shall we say, out of caution, and arrived just in time for a muffled scream. Do you believe, then, that Miss Liddell did not die of natural causes?" "Madam, I don't believe anything yet, but I'll allow myself not to believe in coincidences." Lady Eugenia put down her cup with a soft sound. "Then I suppose you want to talk to everyone?" Poirot nodded. "Naturally. But first, I need to see the place where it happened." The scream. Bentley led him to the music room. The room was exactly as it had been left after the arrival of the local police, who had merely ordered a cursory inspection, more out of deference to the family than out of any real suspicion. The black grand piano occupied the center of the room. The music was scattered, as if someone had played it in haste or anger. On the floor, an oval mark in the carpet indicated where the body lay. To one side, on the piano stool, lay the blue veil. Poirot approached. He didn't touch anything, he just watched. "Too much order," he murmured. Who would place a veil over a corpse if not out of compassion? And yet this gesture so delicate. To hide, to clear something more obvious. He took a few slow steps around the room, scrutinizing the frames, the thick curtains, the unlit chandeliers. "Bentley, would you allow me a floor plan of the house?" "Yes, sir. We have several archived in the library." "Perfect. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to begin the interviews, one by one, in any order. Not the one that suits politeness, but the one that suits the art of deduction. First, Judith Carstairs." The young heiress stood on the enclosed terrace, watching the raindrops form rivers on the glass. When Poirot entered, she woke up with a start. It was evident she hadn't slept well. Her face had an ashen tinge, and her eyes were red. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in a barely audible voice. "Mademoiselle, thank you for having me. I imagine this return isn't easy for you." "It isn't. Everything here seems unfamiliar. Or maybe too familiar." "Did you know Miss Liddell well?" Judith hesitated. "Yes, he raised me for years, but we've been having disagreements lately." Poirot tilted his head. "Disagreements? About what?" "About my inheritance. She thought I shouldn't accept anything, that I should leave everything to charity. She said the Carstairs money was tainted. I didn't see it that way. And the veil..." Judith blinked. "That? The blue veil you were wearing this morning, where did you leave it?" "I don't know. I thought I'd put it on the coat rack in the hall, but then it disappeared. I figured someone had picked it up." "And what did you think when you saw him on the body?" Judith looked down. "I felt like someone wanted to blame me." Poirot didn't reply immediately. His gaze rested on a withered orchid hanging over the threshold. "Mademoiselle, I would appreciate it if you didn't leave the house without my knowledge. Any memory, no matter how small, can be revealing." Judith nodded slowly. Second, Colonel Desmond Blake. He found him in the library, leafing through a book of military strategy with the air of someone who isn't reading, but waiting. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without rising, "I appreciate your reputation, but I hope you don't see ghosts where there aren't any." "I'm not looking for them, Colonel. But if a ghost is walking around with a blue veil, it's worth paying attention to." Blake snorted. He was a man with a deep voice and a curt manner. Liddell was a fragile woman. She lived obsessed with the past. Maybe her heart couldn't take it. "And you? Were you aware of that past?" "I knew enough. Alaric and I were partners for 20 years. She was a governess, not a saint. I saw suspicious things." "Like what?" "Tensions with Eugenia, old debts, burned letters." Poirot sat up slightly. "Cards?" "I saw them one night, years ago. Liddell took them out of a hidden drawer in the piano. I can't imagine, can you? She was a clever woman. She burned them one by one." "And do you know what they contained?" "Number. But I saw a name on one of them. Judith." Poirot thanked him and left without another word. Third, Lucille March. She was in her room, reclining with a half-empty glass of sherry. She was wearing a silk dressing gown and reading a play script with theatrical indifference. I didn't expect to see you, Monsieur Poirot. I thought you only dealt with kings and millionaires, not fainting old women. Oh, madame, Poirot smiled. Sometimes death visits the humble to entangle the powerful. Liddell despised me. He said I'd seduced Alaric. What an old-fashioned word, don't you think? And he did it? That's all in the past. But I'll tell you something. When the will was found, Liddell said he'd destroy the house before he'd leave me a cent. Curious, you're not mentioned in the will. Lucille looked at him for a long time. We'll know soon enough. Sometimes the dead write things they shouldn't have. Poirot watched her for a moment longer. Where were you this morning at 9 o'clock? In my room, putting on my makeup. You can ask the maid. I will, madame. Believe me, I will. 4th, Ambrose Merryweather. The notary was in the dining room drinking his 3rd cup of coffee. His hands were trembling slightly. Mr. Poirot, I'm not cut out for this. I only came to deliver a will. And he did it? Not yet. This morning's event interrupted everything, but the document is here. He took out a thick, sealed envelope. I thought it prudent not to read it without an official presence, although... His voice lowered. I know what it says. It includes important changes. As deletions, additions. I can't reveal names, but Miss Liddell was fiercely opposed. She was the one who tried to hide the document when we discovered it. I retrieved it at Lady Eugenie's insistence. And you think that has anything to do with his death? Merryweather swallowed. I'll just say that this document changed many loyalties. That evening, Poirot walked through the halls of Hartwell Manor alone. He looked at the old paintings, the hidden cracks in the mouldings, the echoes of muffled conversations. Finally, he stopped in front of the piano. The veil was still there, folded. Poirot looked at it for a long time, then, very gently, he took it between his fingers. One woman covers another. To hide the scream, she said to herself, but it wasn't compassion, it was calculation, and calculations sometimes fail. She folded the veil with mathematical precision and placed it on the back of the stool. Tomorrow is another day. The lies will begin to unravel like wet silk. He walked out of the room with a firm step, and the veil remained alone, covering the air as if it were still floating over a body that did not want to be forgotten. Chapter 3. The Testament of the Uninvited. The next morning, a faint winter sun managed to pierce the clouds, shedding its light onto the frosty gardens of Hartwell Manor. The fog had lifted slightly, but not the uncertainty that enveloped every corner of the house. The atmosphere had a dense quality, heavy with unspoken words, shifting glances, and a silent expectation that seemed to curl around the ceiling mouldings. In the library, the meeting was imminent. Sir Alaric Carstairs' will, hidden for years, would now be read. And although no one would admit it, everyone knew that its contents would not only determine the division of assets, but perhaps cast a different shadow over Miss Liddell's death. Poirot was in the adjoining room, reviewing his notebook again while sipping his coffee with milk with meticulous slowness. Seated opposite him, Mr. Ambrose Merryweather flipped through the document with a constrained expression, as if each line were a piece of dynamite wrapped in legal paper. Monsieur Merryweather, said Poirot, without taking his eyes off his cup. Before I read it to those present, allow me a question. Do you believe that this will was written under full mental capacity? Merryweather hesitated. Yes. It was signed 2 months before Sir Alaric's death. He was lucid, calm even, unusually resigned. And did anyone else know? Only Lady Eugenia, Miss Liddell, and the previous executor, one Rupert Giles, who died shortly after. Poirot looked up with sudden interest. And how did that Mr. Giles die? An accident. He fell down a flight of stairs at home. The police closed the case without further investigation. He was elderly, with balance problems. Curious. Very curious. Poirot closed the notebook. I beg you, sir, that we proceed. It's time for the masks to begin to fall. One by one. The library filled slowly. Lady Eugénie sat at the head of the table with an imperial gesture, Judith at her side, still pale. Lucille March arrived with a captivating perfume and the expression of someone who already knows the outcome. Colonel Blake settled himself slowly, still wearing his leather gloves. Everyone fell silent when Merryweather cleared his throat and began. Last will and testament of Sir Alaric James Carstairs, he read in a clear though hesitant voice. Poirot didn't sit down. He stood with his arms crossed, observing not so much the words as the faces. The document began with predictable courtesies, donations to the servants, a symbolic sum to the local parish. But then came the twist. And I hereby revoke all prior versions of this will. As of this date, I leave my fortune, property, titles, and rights to my legitimate niece, Judith Carstairs. Merryweather paused. With one exception, everyone looked up. The west wing of Hartwell Manor, together with the property contained therein, shall become the permanent property of Miss Marjorie Liddell, with lifelong right of occupancy. A thick silence filled the room. Poirot leaned forward. But that clause, it's no longer valid, is it? That's right, Merryweather said ruefully. With Miss Liddell's death, the entire estate reverts to the principal heir. Convenient, don't you think? Lucille chimed in with a half-smile. Very efficient. Judith didn't react. Lady Eugenia did. And there are no other legacies? No mention of the rest of those present? Merryweather shook his head. None. Colonel Blake stood up immediately. So, if you'll excuse me, I see no reason to continue wasting time here. Au contraire, Colonel, Poirot intervened softly. I believe that it is precisely now that the story begins, because with this will, all the motives change, all the roles are rewritten. Lucille leaned back in her seat, playing with a strand of her hair. Not for me. I never expected anything. Not from Alaric, not from his niece, not from his sanctimonious governess. But you knew, didn't you? Said Poirot, approaching slowly. You knew that Marjorie Liddell would inherit something, and you hated her for it. What are you implying? Nothing yet. I'm just making an observation. It's the way my little grey cells work. Lady Eugenia then stood up, her voice cutting. This has become a pantomime. Did you come to read a will or to make innuendos? Poirot bowed slightly. Both, madame. Because every crime, if there ever was one, begins with a motive, and we read it aloud this morning. Later, as the rest dispersed, Judith approached Poirot in the corridor. Her voice was barely a whisper. Do you think someone killed Miss Liddell? For this? Poirot looked at her with almost paternal compassion. I don't know yet, mademoiselle. But I'll tell you something. Greed rarely acts alone. It always allies itself with fear or shame. And your former governess seemed to have enemies of both kinds. I never hated her, Judith said quickly. I didn't say that, but others did. Isn't that right? She nodded with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Lucille, the Colonel, even my aunt. Everyone despised her, even if they pretended to be polite. And you? Did he tell you anything before he died? Judith hesitated. Yes. He told me that if the will came to light, someone in this house would lose more than an inheritance, but he wouldn't say who. Ah, that changes a lot of things, mademoiselle. A lot of things. That night, Poirot walked through the house again. He wasn't looking for fingerprints or hidden revolvers. He was looking for the language of the rooms, how the doors closed, where the stairs creaked, which paintings were askew, invisible to the eye but obvious to logic. As he passed through the west wing, the lock on Liddell's room caught his eye. Forced. He took a magnifying glass out of his pocket. There, on the bronze, was a small dent. Someone had broken into it after his death. He entered quietly. The room was spotless, too spotless. The sheets were neatly folded, the mirror clean. On the dresser, an antique Bible, and inside it a floral bookmark, a small letter. Poirot didn't open it yet. He just examined it. It was addressed to Judith, for the day you discover the truth. He left the room and put the letter in his coat. It wasn't the time, not yet. The pieces had to fall into place on their own. Returning to the hallway, he ran into Bentley, who was looking at him with visible discomfort. Monsieur Poirot, I don't know if I should say this, but I heard something last night. Yeah, someone crying, too late. It was coming from the music room. When I got closer, there was no one there, just the veil, hanging from the chandelier as if it had been left there too. To be found, Poirot stared at him. Bentley, listen to me carefully. If you hear anything like that again, don't ignore it. The killer has already spoken once. Maybe he will again. While the house slept, Hercule Poirot, with his hands clasped behind his back, looked out of a window overlooking the frost-covered garden. A will that restores what was lost, a death that erases an obstacle, a veil that both conceals and reveals. It's all part of a single game, and in this game, the murderer always leaves a psychological mark. He turned slowly toward the dark hallway. Tomorrow I'll start with the real questions. Chapter 4. Echoes in the music room. The music room had no clocks, only the black piano, the walls panelled in crimson velvet, and an antique lamp whose shade cast a soft, flickering light over the keys, as if each note were waiting its turn to be played again. It was there that Poirot decided to sit that morning, not as a detective, but as a listener. He didn't want to interrogate yet. He wanted to hear. Crime, as he well knew, had its own tone. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes an echo, but it always spoke. At 9 o'clock sharp, Bentley entered with his usual discretion and served him a cup of hot chocolate. Poirot took it gratefully, still staring at the piano. "Can you play, Monsieur Bentley?" The butler was surprised. "A little when I was young. My mother was a music teacher." "Oh, and Miss Liddell?" "She did too. She played every evening, her fingers still clumsy with age, always the same pieces. A field nocturne, some hymns, and an adagio no one else recognized." "Do you remember?" "Yes, it was monotonous, sad, as if a note was missing." Poirot nodded slowly. A veiled scream, and a melody missing a note. "This house isn't cursed, Monsieur Bentley. It's incomplete." Bentley didn't respond. He just bowed and walked silently away. Poirot was left alone with his thoughts. It was then that Lucille March appeared on the threshold. Unannounced, without asking permission. She was dressed in black, with a velvet robe that dragged lightly on the carpet. Her eyes, lined with theatrical precision, regarded him with a mixture of defiance and curiosity. "Have you already discovered the murderer, Monsieur Poirot?" "Ah, madame. If it were that simple, I would have retired years ago." "Maybe he's discovered it, but is waiting for the dramatic moment to reveal it." You understand the rhythm of the scene well. But real crime isn't theatre, madame. Applause doesn't decide everything. The truth does. Lucille walked in uninvited and sat down at the piano. You know what I think? That Liddell killed himself. Poirot raised an eyebrow. That has not been suggested yet. No need. You thought about it, at least for a second. And why would he do that, do you think? Because I knew something. Something I didn't want to get out. And what did he know? Ask your niece. With that, Lucille pressed a deep key. Have you never noticed that the biggest secrets always come in the form of silence? Poirot approached calmly. And you, madame? Have you kept any of those silences? She smiled without showing her teeth. Monsieur Poirot, if women didn't know how to keep secrets, the world would have collapsed centuries ago. And he left. An hour later, Poirot asked to speak to Lady Eugénie. He found her in the greenhouse, standing among withered plants, like a statue mistakenly placed among living things. She wasn't dressed in mourning, nor did she show any signs of distress. She seemed more steadfast than ever. I find it curious, madame, said Poirot, that your husband should have included Miss Liddell in his will, when you never seemed to have any affection for her. Alaric did a lot of things without consulting me. He was always consistent about that. And how did you react when you found out? Lady Eugenia looked at him directly. With resignation. I wasn't going to fight over a property that, sooner or later, would return to my niece. Marjorie had no heirs. It was just a matter of time. But it wasn't time that caught up with her, madame. It was something more immediate. Are you implying that I benefited from his death? No, madame. I'm implying that everyone did except her. A heavy silence settled between them. Then Lady Eugénie turned to a dying plant. Have you spoken to Judith? Not yet. Do it. You'll find her in the portrait gallery. It's the only place where her face doesn't betray fear. Poirot slowly climbed the grand oak staircase and entered the gallery. There, among portraits of ancestors with faded looks, Judith was looking at one painting in particular. That of a woman with dark hair and intense eyes, dressed in blue. Your mother? Asked Poirot. Judith nodded. She died when I was 6. Sometimes I think Miss Liddell tried to replace her, but there was always something cold about her affection, as if she cared more for what she stood for than for me. And your aunt? Did you love her? In his own way. He raised me to be strong, but I don't know if he ever understood me. Poirot stood beside him. Madame Liddell left something for you, a letter. I haven't opened it. It's not my place. Would you like to read it now? Judith looked at him with sudden fear. Now? Sometimes the truth comes when we're least prepared, or when we need it most. Judith took the letter with trembling hands. She tore open the envelope. She read it silently. Her lips parted, but she didn't say a word. Poirot waited. Finally, Judith murmured, he says, that my mother didn't die as we thought, that she was driven to despair, that there were letters, evidence, and that she hid them for fear of destroying someone who still lives. Who? He doesn't say it. Poirot looked at her for a long time. A letter that insinuates, without accusing, a melody missing a note. Do you know what it means, mademoiselle? That? Someone else has read that letter, and they don't want you to know the ending of the melody. Judith looked at him in panic. Do you think I'm in danger? I think the danger has already occurred, and now the culprit hopes no one hears him repeat his note. That evening, Poirot dined alone in his room. The steak was overcooked, but he didn't complain. His thoughts weren't on the food, but on the people. Eugenia, control. Lucille, contempt. Blake, impatience. Judith, fear. And in the middle of them all, an ancient shadow that still had no name. As she poured herself a second cup of tea, there was a knock at her door. Era Bentley. Monsieur Poirot, I think you should see this. He handed him a score. It was in the piano drawer, wrapped in a sheet of parchment. It's not Liddell's, it's signed. Sir Alaric. Poirot examined the sheet. A simple composition, but with a note clearly crossed out. In its place, a strange symbol. It wasn't musical, it was a letter, a J. You see, Bentley said, it's like that note is. An initial. Yes, murmured Poirot. And perhaps it is. He held the sheet up to the lamp. On the back, blurred writing appeared in the light. I won't leave her in your hands. Poirot put the score in his jacket. Thank you, Mr. Bentley. You've just revealed something more valuable than a confession. You've just shown me that this crime began long before the crime. That night, the rain returned. The music room was empty, but the piano seemed to play a single note, as if remembering something the others had forgotten. And somewhere in the west wing, a door softly closed, as if someone were still playing the incomplete melody. Chapter 5. The Note That Wasn't Played. Dawn found Hercule Poirot already awake, sitting by his bedroom window, watching the mist creep slowly over the garden hedges like a curtain that refused to rise. Between his fingers, he held Sir Alaric's neatly folded score. The strange symbol on the crossed-out note, the J, stared at him from the paper like a squinting eye, revealing more than it revealed. Poirot knew that the mystery didn't revolve solely around Marjorie Liddell's will or death. The crime, if it had truly been such, hadn't been born out of a momentary impulse, but from a chain of carefully woven decisions with ancient, bitter, personal roots. As he finished his morning routine, brushing his moustache, straightening the creases of his trousers, ensuring each button on his waistcoat shone with just the right reflection, Poirot made a resolution. The time had come to reconstruct the past. If he wanted to understand the truth of the present, he must discover who was willing to silence not only an old woman, but also a melody. He went down to the living room unannounced and asked everyone to gather, not in the library or the dining room, but in the music room. Today, he said calmly as the group sat down with growing discomfort, I won't ask questions, I'll just listen. Lucille March frowned. Blake snorted impatiently. Lady Eugenia folded her hands icily. Judith, on the other hand, seemed more serene than the day before, as if reading Liddell's letter had ripped away a bandage that had been stuck to her soul for too long. I want, continued Poirot, that you listen to this. He placed the score on the piano stand and, with deliberate slowness, pressed the keys as directed until he reached the crossed-out note. There, he stopped. This note wasn't touched, he said quietly. It was deleted, replaced. Why? Silence. Because it said something, because it suggested something the composer wanted to hide, or point out. That note isn't a note. It's a letter, an initial, and that initial is J. Judith paled visibly. Blake glanced at her. Lady Eugenia didn't blink. Judith, Poirot said without turning around, your name was in your uncle's writings, also in the letters Liddell burned according to Colonel Blake, and now in this music. Why? Judith didn't respond immediately, but her voice, when it came, was firm. Because I'm the reason my mother committed suicide. Lucille let out a theatrical sigh. Blake tensed. Poirot didn't intervene. He just nodded gently, like someone surprised not by a confession but by the timing of its occurrence. My mother, Judith continued, didn't die of sadness. She died of humiliation. Liddell hinted at it for years, but I didn't understand until I found an old letter in a photo album. A letter from her. To Alaric. What did that letter say? Poirot asked in a neutral voice. That she couldn't stand living in a house where she was seen as an intruder, where her daughter was a nuisance, where her marriage was a burden. Poirot crossed his arms. So your mother was married to Sir Alaric. Lady Eugenie reacted for the first time. Her fan fell to the floor. That's absurd, he muttered. Is it, madame? Said Poirot quietly. Or is it simply inconvenient? Lucille smiled like someone who senses a play approaching its climax. Are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot, that Judith was the legitimate daughter of the owner of this house? I'm not suggesting that, Poirot replied. I affirm it, and not just because of the letter. The will confirms it. The West Wing was assigned to Liddell not as a charity, but as collateral. She knew, and Alaric gave her something in return for her silence. Judith buried her head in her hands. Blake watched everyone as if trying to reconstruct the battlefield in his mind. Lady Eugenie, however, remained unfazed. That woman, he said, was never more than a pretentious servant. She slipped into my husband's bed while I looked after his reputation. There was never a marriage, no priest, no registration. There's no need for records, madame, Poirot said slowly, when you have a child growing up under the same roof who is removed from the will under family pressure, only to be returned years later when conscience begins to outweigh scandal. What does that have to do with Liddell? Blake interrupted. Why would anyone kill an old woman now? Poirot approached the piano, where the score was still open. Because Liddell, after years of silence, was about to speak, because he knew something else, and because that will wasn't the only secret he planned to reveal. He opened his notebook. Last night I discovered that the lock on his room had been forced. Someone broke in after his death. They were looking for something, and they didn't find it, because what Liddell wanted to deliver was already in other hands. He looked at Judith. Judith looked at him in surprise. They? Yes, you received the letter. But that's what they didn't find, and what they couldn't bear to exist. Because what Liddell was hiding wasn't a threat to the fortune, but to the image of this family, of this house, and of the self-respect of someone too proud to admit a past mistake. Lady Eugenia stood up with iron dignity. Are you implying that I— No, madame, Poirot said gently. I'm not implying, not yet. But the pieces are beginning to fall into place, and the next time we play this tune, the unplayed note, will be heard. That afternoon, Poirot requested access to Sir Alaric's personal files. Bentley led him to a secondary office that had remained locked for years. There, among dusty folders, he found something curious, a set of audio tapes. Sir Alaric began recording his memoirs in the last years of his life, Bentley explained. He did it when no one was looking. He said it was his way of talking to those who would come after him. Poirot placed a tape in the portable player he found in the same cabinet. Sir Alaric's voice, raspier and weaker than he expected, began to play. If you're listening to this, Judith, it's because I didn't have the courage to tell you myself. You were my daughter, and also my greatest shame. Not for you, but for not having the courage to stand up for your mother. I failed her, and I failed you. Marjorie. She protected you however she could, though in her own way, dry, stern. She did it for me. She did it because I asked her to. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. Then he pressed stop. In the silence that followed, a dull thud was heard. Something fell in the next room. Poirot stood up and crossed the threshold. The closet door was open. Inside, a black cloak hung, and at its feet a crumpled sheet of paper. He unfolded it. It was a letter written in blue ink, signed Lucille March. If she talks, I'll talk too. And this time I won't be silenced by promises or jewels. Poirot frowned. Then, Mademoiselle March is not a stranger to this drama as she pretends. That night, the music room was once again filled with shadows. Poirot sat alone at the piano. This time he played the entire melody, without missing a note. When he reached it, he firmly pressed the marked key. A high, off-key sound emerged, like a scream trapped in wood. Poirot bent down. He removed the top lid of the piano. There, taped under the strings, was a key. He carefully lifted it. Hand engraved on the base were the letters M.L., Marjorie Liddell, the key to her truth. Poirot smiled slightly. Tomorrow, mes amis. The melody will be played in full. Chapter 6. The Key of Silence. The next day's dawn seemed different, not because of the light, which still reached us in faint slivers through the mist, but because of the latent feeling that something was approaching. A threshold, a crack, a confession. Hercule Poirot, sitting at his desk in the south-facing room, held the small key between his fingers, turning it as if turning it might also unlock the locked souls of the inhabitants of Hartwell Manor. The inscription at its base, M.L., was unmistakable. Marjorie Liddell had hidden that key inside the piano, on the most out-of-tune note of the melody, as if she feared someone would find it, but at the same time hoped that, in time, someone would. A conflicting will, a divided conscience. Poirot knew well that there is no crime without contradiction, and that murderers don't kill out of necessity, but out of desperation. After his prompt breakfast, toast, fig jam, and black coffee with exactly 3 spoonfuls of sugar, he went down to the hall where Judith was waiting for him, already dressed, wearing a closed coat and wool gloves. Her face, though marked by insomnia, looked firmer, more willing. "Did you find her?" he asked bluntly. Poirot lifted the key. "Oui, mademoiselle. This key was the secret Liddell dared not share. But it's not enough to have the key. You have to know which door it opens." "And you know it?" Poirot nodded very slightly. "I suspect, but we need to be sure. Will you come with me?" Judith hesitated for a moment, but nodded. Together they walked through the west wing, the one Liddell had inhabited for decades, and which now seemed to be awaiting its own burial. The corridor was cold, the windows covered by thick curtains. Mould crept up the walls in undulating lines. At the far end, the governess's room was just as Poirot had seen it days before, austere, clean, meticulously tidy. Yet something had troubled him then, and he noticed it again now. The desk, old, with worn edges and an off-centre lock. Poirot inserted the key. He turned it. One click. The bottom drawer opened slowly. Inside was a small wooden box, locked with a hasp, and an unstamped white envelope. Judith approached, but Poirot raised a hand. "Carefully, mademoiselle. Not for fear of traps, but out of respect." He opened the envelope first. The letter was short. "If you are reading this, then I have failed. I've kept quiet for years out of fear. Of Eugenia, of Alaric, of myself. But the girl deserves the truth. Mrs. Carstairs threatened her, humiliated her, and when she wanted to speak, when she wanted to get a divorce and leave this place, he pushed her away, literally. Judith never knew. She thought her mother had committed suicide, but I saw it. From the hallway, and I have lived with that silence ever since. M.L. Judith let out a soft moan, but she didn't cry. She just closed her eyes, as if the weight of the world had finally been named. Poirot opened the box. Inside, a series of documents, birth certificates, unsent letters, old photographs, and a gold ring with engraved initials A.C.M.R. Asked Poirot. Judith denied. "It belongs to her mother," said Poirot. "M.C.R., Marianne Rosenthal. That was her maiden name, an engagement ring, hidden for years, like everything else." Judith covered her mouth. So, it was her. Poirot turned slowly towards her. Madame Carstairs didn't kill her mother with a knife. But she did push her, yes, literally and psychologically. Maybe the fall was accidental, maybe not. But what followed was a decade of silence, of lies, woven by hands that pretend to tremble with age, not guilt. And Miss Liddell. She saw it, but she didn't report it, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of gratitude. Alaric offered her protection, a life, an entire wing of this mansion. She accepted the deal, but she never stopped writing, or saving. Poirot gathered all the papers neatly and put them in his briefcase. Then he turned to Judith. "Now you must decide, mademoiselle. This truth belongs to you. You can make it public, or you can bury it again." Judith didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the ring, on that golden circle that held like a knot all the unlived lives. Hours later, Poirot summoned everyone to the main drawing room. The tension was almost physical. Blake stood apart. Lucille sat as if bored by the event. Lady Eugenie wasn't wearing her usual fan, only a string of pearls as tight as a shackle. Judith, standing next to Poirot, no longer seemed fearful, only determined. "Mesdames, messieurs," Poirot began in his most serious tone, "this meeting is not to reveal the murderer, not yet. It's to reveal the context, because no crime is born in a vacuum. It needs roots, fertile soil, shadows." He paused briefly to make sure no one could look away. Miss Liddell's death wasn't a coincidence, nor was it natural. It was a crime. And the key to understanding it lies not in her enemies but in what she knew. He looked directly at Lady Eugenia. You knew she was about to speak. "Talk?" the woman interrupted coldly. That woman didn't say anything without permission. That's precisely what changed, because she was no longer afraid. She knew that her protection, her pact with Sir Alaric, had died with him. And so she began to write, to organize documents, to prepare a delivery. Poirot took out the letter and placed it on the table without opening it yet. This letter, addressed to Judith, was written 2 weeks before her death, and in it Miss Liddell confesses to having seen something. Something that happened years ago, in this house. The death of Marianne Rosenthal. A slight shudder ran through the room. "According to this letter," Poirot continued, "Mrs. Carstairs pushed the young mother down the stairs during an argument, perhaps not with the intention of killing her, but with enough coolness not to come to her aid afterward." "That's an outrage!" Lady Eugenie roared, rising to her feet. "Yes? And why then did you never let Judith know the truth about her mother? Why hide the marriage, the ring, the inheritance?" Lady Eugenie didn't respond. She just sat down slowly, as if her body refused to hold the mask for another second. "You didn't kill Liddell with your own hands," Poirot continued, "but you kept her prisoner for years. And when she finally decided to talk, you couldn't stop her. But someone else could." Poirot turned to Lucille March. "Madame, I found a letter from you, a veiled threat, in Sir Alaric's room, signed by you." Lucille opened her eyes in mock surprise. "That doesn't prove anything." "Number." But the dust in your suitcase did. The dust in the piano compartment. You searched that room. You were looking for the papers, the letter, maybe even the key, and when you didn't find it, you went to silence the only person who could deliver them. Lucille, without abandoning her smile, shrugged her shoulders. I didn't mean to kill her, just scare her. She slipped. She hit the piano. I didn't know what to do. I covered her with the veil. I left. Judith approached. Her voice was soft but firm. And then you said it was a heart attack. Lucille looked down. She took everything from me, even the memory. Alaric promised to let me have part of the house, but then he changed his mind. Because of you. Poirot closed the notebook. The crime in the end was about fear, the fear of being left out, of not being the chosen one. But fear, she turned to everyone, is also the sound that most quickly becomes an echo, and the echo, this time, had arrived. That evening, while Lucille March was discreetly escorted by the local authorities, Poirot and Judith walked through the garden. The fog had dissipated. The moss-covered marble statues seemed more human in the soft light. And now? Judith asked. Poirot smiled slightly. Now you decide what to do with the story. You can turn it into stone, or into music. Judith nodded. Then she stopped. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for not telling me who he was, but helping me find out. He bowed his head with his usual elegance. That's the truth, mademoiselle. It's always been her who sings. You just had to listen. To the note that wasn't played. Chapter 7. Poirot's final comment. The house, for the first time in days, breathed. It wasn't exactly calm that reigned in Hartwell Manor, but a kind of exhaled silence, like that which occurs after a confession or a storm. The shadows were still there, stuck to the frames, suspended in the curtains, but now they seemed devoid of their poison. The crime had spoken. The melody had sounded complete. Hercule Poirot, unhurriedly, was finishing packing his belongings into his grey suitcase. His movements were methodical, almost ceremonial. A handkerchief folded with mathematical precision, his brush case lined up next to his silver comb, his waistcoat buttons fastened with exact symmetry. A light knock on the door interrupted his preparations. Bentley, as always discreet, poked his head out. Madame Carstairs has asked to see you, Monsieur Poirot. She is in the portrait gallery. Poirot nodded gravely. Thank you, Mr. Bentley. Ja es ora. Lady Eugenie stood directly in front of her husband's portrait. Sir Alaric, painted with the hieratic expression of those who conceal more than they reveal, seemed to gaze at her without judgment or mercy. The high gallery lights made the painting glow in certain places, as if the oil transpired its own guilt. He wasn't a good man, Eugenia said, without turning around when she noticed Poirot's presence, but he was no worse than I. Poirot didn't reply immediately. He walked with short steps until he was at her side. Sometimes, he said softly, evil isn't hidden in grand acts, but in small decisions repeated for years, in veiled humiliations, in imposed silences. Eugenia closed her eyes. I didn't kill Marianne, but I did nothing to prevent her downfall, and then I allowed Judith to grow up believing herself to be a bastard. It was my revenge, small, miserable, but mine. And Liddell knew it, added Poirot. Yes, and she reproached him in her own way, stiffly, with distance. But she hated me, and with good reason. A soft sigh escaped the woman's lips, though her composure was not broken. I never thought Lucille would go this far. I thought she'd threaten, maybe blackmail, but not murder. I should have seen it. Poirot merely nodded. Sometimes, madame, pawns also kill the queen, when they think they'll save the board. Eugenia took a step back. Her eyes were dry, but filled with a tiredness she could no longer feign. What will Judith do with the letter? He hasn't decided yet. I hope he burns it. Yeah? Yes? Not because he's protecting me, but because I don't want his life to become an extension of ours, of our pettiness. Poirot watched her for a moment longer. I don't know, madame. There are wounds that heal with fire, and others with truth. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Eugenia said something else. Not with resentment, not with cynicism, with raw honesty. I loved her, you know. Judith. In my twisted way, she was the only living thing in this house of the dead. Poirot didn't turn around, but his words, when they came, were gentle. Sometimes, madame, love resembles hate so much. That one forgets which one has been nursing. On the main terrace, Judith waited. The afternoon had opened a gap in the clouds, and a golden light filtered over the marble floor, causing the shadows to lengthen as if they wanted to leave the room. He's leaving tonight, she said when she saw him appear. Poirot smiled slightly. My train leaves at 6. But before I go, I wanted to see you, mademoiselle, and ask you, what are you going to do about it all? Judith held the envelope in her hands. Her mother's ring glittered on one of her fingers. Her face was calm, but the turmoil was still stirring in her eyes. I don't know. Part of me wants to destroy everything, the letters, the will, the tapes, as if by doing so, I could recapture a childhood I never had. And the other part, the other side, wants to leave everything as is, publish it, name it, shout it out. Let the world know. Poirot nodded, without judgment. Both reactions are. Human one seeks justice, the other, peace. But I'll tell you something, mademoiselle. Truth isn't inherited. It's decided. Judith looked at him intensely. What if I decide to keep it for myself? Then it will be yours, and perhaps one day when it no longer hurts you will share it, not as an accusation, but as an offering. A light breeze stirred the veil Judith still wore on her shoulders, the same one Lucille used to cover Liddell's body. She had retrieved it from the piano that morning, clean, folded. I have a question for you, Monsieur Poirot, he said suddenly. You knew everything beforehand, didn't you? Even before you arrived. Poirot smiled modestly. I suspected. There were threads too well hidden, names that reappeared in silent places, a noteless melody, a will found accidentally, and a death that seemed orderly, too orderly. And why didn't you say it before? Because the truth doesn't impose itself, mademoiselle. It reveals itself, like a flower, like a confession. Judith looked down. Then, with slow movements, she slipped Liddell's letter into the envelope, closed the clasp, and slipped it under a stone planter by the hedge. I'm not burning it, but I'm not giving it up either. Not yet. Poirot bowed his head gently. Then you have chosen wisely. At 5 o'clock, the rain returned. The train departed an hour later, and Bentley, with British punctuality, loaded Poirot's suitcase into the car. Before going up, the detective took one last look at the house. Hartwell Manor no longer seemed like a mausoleum, but a relic that would outlive its ghosts. Lucille March would be in custody until the trial. Lady Eugenie had decided to retire to the countryside. Colonel Blake would leave for Scotland. And Judith would stay, not as an heir to a crime, but as the author of her own future. The car started. Poirot, from the back seat, took out his pocket watch, aligned it with the train timetable, and sighed. An incomplete melody, a veil covering a scream, a key hidden inside a note that no one dared to play. Ah, the ironies of the human soul. He looked out the window, where the countryside was beginning to blur in the rain. Sometimes, Hastings, I wonder if the order of the heart can be achieved through logic, and other times, I just listen. He closed the clock. He closed his eyes, and the music, finally, stopped. Chapter 7. Poirot's final comment. The house, for the first time in days, breathed. It wasn't exactly calm that reigned in Hartwell Manor, but a kind of exhaled silence, like that which occurs after a confession or a storm. The shadows were still there, stuck to the frames, suspended in the curtains, but now they seemed devoid of their poison. The crime had spoken. The melody had sounded complete. Hercule Poirot, unhurriedly, was finishing packing his belongings into his grey suitcase. His movements were methodical, almost ceremonial. A handkerchief folded with mathematical precision, his brush case lined up next to his silver comb, his waistcoat buttons fastened with exact symmetry. A light knock on the door interrupted his preparations. Bentley, as always discreet, poked his head out. "Madame Carster has asked to see you, Monsieur Poirot. She is in the portrait gallery." Poirot nodded gravely. "Thank you, Mr. Bentley. Ja es ora." Lady Eugenie stood directly in front of her husband's portrait. Sir Alaric, painted with the hieratic expression of those who conceal more than they reveal, seemed to gaze at her without judgment or mercy. The high gallery lights made the painting glow in certain places, as if the oil transpired its own guilt. "He wasn't a good man," Eugenia said, without turning around when she noticed Poirot's presence. "But he was no worse than I." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He walked with short steps until he was at her side. "Sometimes," he said softly, "evil isn't hidden in grand acts, but in small decisions repeated for years, in veiled humiliations, in imposed silences." Eugenia closed her eyes. "I didn't kill Marianne, but I did nothing to prevent her downfall, and then I allowed Judith to grow up believing herself to be a bastard. It was my revenge, small, miserable, but mine." "And Liddell knew it," added Poirot. "Yes, and she reproached him in her own way, stiffly, with distance, but she hated me, and with good reason." A soft sigh escaped the woman's lips, though her composure was not broken. "I never thought Lucille would go this far. I thought she'd threaten, maybe blackmail, but not murder. I should have seen it." Poirot merely nodded. "Sometimes, madame, pawns also kill the queen, when they think they'll save the board." Eugenia took a step back. Her eyes were dry, but filled with a tiredness she could no longer feign. "What will Judith do with the letter?" "He hasn't decided yet. I hope he burns it." "Yeah?" "Yes. Not because he's protecting me, but because I don't want his life to become an extension of ours, of our pettiness." Poirot watched her for a moment longer. "I don't know, madame. There are wounds that heal with fire, and others with truth." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Eugenia said something else. Not with resentment, not with cynicism, with raw honesty. "I loved her, you know, Judith, in my twisted way. She was the only living thing in this house of the dead." Poirot didn't turn around, but his words, when they came, were gentle. "Sometimes, madame, love resembles hate so much that one forgets which one has been nursing." On the main terrace, Judith waited. The afternoon had opened a gap in the clouds, and a golden light filtered over the marble floor, causing the shadows to lengthen as if they wanted to leave the room. "He's leaving tonight," she said when she saw him appear. Poirot smiled slightly. "My train leaves at 6, but before I go, I wanted to see you, mademoiselle, and ask you." What are you going to do about it all? Judith held the envelope in her hands. Her mother's ring glittered on one of her fingers. Her face was calm, but the turmoil was still stirring in her eyes. I don't know. Part of me wants to destroy everything. The letters, the will, the tapes. As if by doing so, I could recapture a childhood I never had. And the other part, the other side, wants to leave everything as is, publish it, name it, shout it out, let the world know. Poirot nodded without judgment. Both reactions are human. One seeks justice, the other peace. But I'll tell you something, mademoiselle. Truth isn't inherited, it's decided. Judith looked at him intensely. What if I decide to keep it for myself? Then it will be yours, and perhaps one day, when it no longer hurts, you will share it, not as an accusation, but as an offering. A light breeze stirred the veil Judith still wore on her shoulders, the same one Lucille used to cover Liddell's body. She had retrieved it from the piano that morning, clean, folded. I have a question for you, Monsieur Poirot, he said suddenly. You knew everything beforehand, didn't you? Even before you arrived. Poirot smiled modestly. I suspected. There were threads too well hidden, names that reappeared in silent places, a noteless melody, a will found accidentally, and a death that seemed orderly, too orderly. And why didn't you say it before? Because the truth doesn't impose itself, mademoiselle. It reveals itself, like a flower, like a confession. Judith looked down. Then, with slow movements, she slipped Liddell's letter into the envelope, closed the clasp, and slipped it under a stone planter by the hedge. I'm not burning it, but I'm not giving it up either. Not yet. Poirot bowed his head gently. Then you have chosen wisely. At 5 o'clock, the rain returned. The train departed an hour later, and Bentley, with British punctuality, loaded Poirot's suitcase into the car. Before going up, the detective took one last look at the house. Hartwell Manor no longer seemed like a mausoleum, but a relic that would outlive its ghosts. Lucille March would be held in custody until the trial. Lady Eugenie had decided to retire to the countryside. Colonel Blake would be leaving for Scotland, and Judith would be staying, not as an heir to a crime, but as the author of her own future. The car started. Poirot, from the back seat, took out his pocket watch, aligned it with the train timetable, and sighed. An incomplete melody, a veil covering a scream, a key hidden inside a note that no one dared to play. Ah, the ironies of the human soul. He looked out the window, where the countryside was beginning to blur in the rain. Sometimes, Hastings, I wonder if the order of the heart can be achieved through logic, and other times, I just listen. He closed the clock, he closed his eyes, and the music, finally, stopped. Chapter 8. The Echo That Did Not Die. The train had already departed. The Hartwell Manor parlour was silent. Outside, the rain fell with an almost meditative constancy, enveloping the estate in a murmur that seemed more meditative than meteorological. But inside the mansion, not all was asleep. Judith was alone in the music room. For the first time since Miss Liddell's death, she sat down at the piano. Her hand slid slowly over the keys, as if seeking to sense the memory trapped in the wood. She played the first note of the adagio, then the next, until she reached the one Poirot had called, the note that was not played. But this time, Judith didn't hesitate. She pressed firmly. The note rang out cleanly, clearer than I remembered. The echo vibrated for a moment and then died away. But it wasn't the only sound in the room. I always hated that melody. Judith was startled. Standing on the threshold of the door with a folded blanket over her arms was Lady Eugenia. "Why?" Judith asked after recovering from her shock. Because it was a lament, not even a piece of mourning, but a cowardly lament. As if someone were begging for forgiveness without having the courage to ask for it with words. Judith turned toward her cautiously. "Did you know I was coming?" "Yes. The butler told me you were back. I didn't think you'd be back so soon, or that you'd be sitting right there at that piano." Lady Eugenie moved to the edge of the carpet and draped the blanket over the back of an armchair. Then, without permission, she sat down opposite her niece. "I want to talk to you." Judith watched her, with the same mixture of distance and need that had fueled their relationship for years. "Speak." Lady Eugenie held his gaze for a moment before looking away. "When your mother died, I didn't cry. I feigned surprise, I feigned outrage, and I feigned motherhood, but really, all I felt was relief." Judith didn't blink. Because she was a threat. Because I couldn't bear what her existence meant to me, and to him. Your father wasn't a saint, Judith, but he loved you, in his own way, and her, too. There was a long silence. "Did you push her?" Judith asked, her voice lacking emotional charge, just like someone needing a clarification on a pending letter. Lady Eugenia gently shook her head. "Number. But I didn't hold her arm when she almost fell either. It was one of those arguments on the landing. You were asleep. She said she couldn't stand it anymore. I told her not to then. She took a step back and fell. First period." I froze. Judith looked down. "And then he told Liddell it was suicide." I didn't need to tell her. Liddell already knew. She saw it. She kept quiet out of convenience. She didn't report me, not out of fear, but out of pragmatism. And over time, that cowardice ate away at her. It turned her into a shadow. Judith got up from the piano and went to the window. The rain was soaking the withered rose bushes. "Do you want me to forgive you?" "Number." "So." Lady Eugenia also stood up. Her figure no longer resembled a tower, but one carved by the weight of too much inaction. "I just wanted you to know from me. Not from a letter. Not from Poirot. From me. I'll leave tomorrow. I've left everything in the lawyer's hands. This house belongs to you. With everything that means." Judith did not turn around. "What if I decide to leave it empty? Then it will be as full of meaning as when we all lived there pretending to be alive." That night, as the lights went out one by one in the house, Judith lit an oil lamp in the library. She didn't want electricity. She wanted shadows. Her reflection, flickering in the glass, seemed more honest to her than her own face in the mirrors. He was carrying the box Poirot had retrieved from Liddell's desk. He hadn't opened it since. He uncovered it now. He took the ring. He held it up to the light. She remembered a hand that had once caressed her in her cradle, a smell she could no longer name, a smile barely visible in a faded photograph. Then she read the letters, one by one. Some written with anger, others with tenderness. But they all spoke of the same thing, the desire to exist with dignity, to be recognized, to love and be loved without having to hide behind a surname or a veil. Finally, he folded each piece of paper very carefully and put them back in the box. And for the first time he felt no anger, no revenge, no sorrow. He felt a brutal calm, not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of something stronger. Comprehension. The next morning, Judith summoned Bentley and attorney Merriweather. Lucille March had already been transferred by the police to the neighboring county, pending her trial. Colonel Blake had left without saying goodbye. And Lady Eugenia, the butler said, would spend her last night in Hartwell before retiring north. "I want to make changes to the will," Judith said clearly. "And I want to record something else, a posthumous legacy for Marjorie Liddell, not in the form of money, but in memory." The lawyer looked at her in surprise. "Do you want to establish a foundation? Number just a publication, a brief edition, private, with his diaries, his letters, his voice, unaltered, so that it's a record that someone saw the truth and decided not to keep it completely silent." Bentley looked down, moved. "She would have been proud, Miss Judith." "I know," she replied. 2 weeks later, back in London, Poirot received a package wrapped in blue paper. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. When he opened it, he found a small, leather-bound book, The Veil and the Voice, fragments from Marjorie Liddell. Inside, a handwritten dedication, for those who knew how to listen to the note that no one wanted to play. J.C. Poirot smiled. Then, without haste, he placed the book on his personal shelf, between The Psychology of Deception and The Art of Deliberate Silence. He poured himself a cup of tea, sat down by the window, and thought. In the end, the cry wasn't veiled. It was released. And as the London rain gently pattered against the glass, Poirot, the man with the small grey cells, closed his eyes. Not to forget, but to listen. Chapter 9. The Gardens That Never Bloomed Again. Winter crept over Hartwell Manor like a second skin, freezing every tile, every leaf, every trace of colour in the once manicured gardens. The marble statues, stripped of their moss by the frost, now seemed like silent sentinels of a past that refused to fade. The melody that had enveloped the recent days, with its absent notes and prolonged silences, no longer sounded, but it remained, like an invisible imprint on the architecture of the house. Judith Carstairs strolled alone along the gravel paths, wrapped in a thick black wool overcoat. In one hand, she held a small pair of pruning shears, and in the other, a withered branch from one of the ancient rose bushes that grew by the pond. The flowers had stopped blooming. The garden had stopped, or so it seemed. Butler Bentley watched her from the gallery at a prudent distance. His years in the house had taught him when to intervene and when to remain silent. This was a day for the latter. Judith stopped beside a scrawny vine, turned the dead branch between her fingers, and for a moment she looked close to tears. She didn't. Instead, she gently placed it on the stone bench under the pergola, as if leaving an offering for someone she couldn't yet name. "They haven't bloomed again since she died," a voice said behind them. "Era Lady Eugenia." He was wearing a slate-coloured coat and black leather gloves. A small carry-on suitcase lay on the gravel beside him. "It's not the land," he continued. "It's memory." Judith didn't respond immediately. She just looked at her. "Are you coming to say goodbye?" "Yes. I've spoken to Mr. Merriweather. I'm giving up everything. The bills, the property, even my own furniture. This house. It's sucked enough life out of me. It's time to let it go." Judith nodded slightly. "And where will he go?" "Somewhere it doesn't matter. An apartment in Harrogate, or maybe abroad. There are places where no one remembers the Carstairs." A tense silence settled between the two, not hostile, but heavy, like the echo of words yet to be spoken. Finally, Judith spoke. "I want you to know something. I don't hate you." Lady Eugenia slowly looked up. "I don't deserve it." "No," Judith replied. "She doesn't deserve it. But I don't deserve to continue living in resentment either, and above all, My mother didn't deserve it. Lady Eugenie swallowed. For the first time in years, her eyes glazed over. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice more brittle than before. "Clean this house up, not just physically. I want to give it back a decent life, not for me, for what comes next. Turn it into an artist's retreat, or a conservatory, fill it with real music." Lady Eugenia nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I'd like to send you something when I'm settled in. A book. Maybe. A journal." "Do it," Judith said, "but no lies." "I don't know if I know how to write without lies." "Then don't write. Plant something, a rose bush, wherever you go." The old woman smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes. "You are stronger than all of us, Judith." And, without waiting for an answer, he turned, picked up his suitcase, and left. Judith watched her walk away until she turned the corner of the hedge. Only then did she return to the rose bush, and this time, with his bare hands, he began to patiently cut away the withered leaves. 2 days later, a figure crossed the entrance path with a determined stride. It was Ambrose Merriweather, the notary. He carried a large folder under his arm, and under his coat, a clear burden of worry. Judith greeted him in the foyer, which already smelled of new wax and wood. The house was changing, slowly, but changing. "Miss Carstairs," he said without preamble, "I'm afraid I must trouble you with an unexpected matter." "What's going on?" Merriweather opened the folder and held out a sheet of paper. "A second will has appeared. Very old, more like a codicil, signed by Sir Alaric, but undated. It was found inside a bound volume in his personal library during the inventory of his estates." Judith read, "Is it legitimate?" "That's the strange thing, yes. The signature is authentic. It doesn't contradict the official will, but it does add a disturbing clause." Judith looked at him. "Which?" Merriweather took a breath. "That, in the event of the unexpected death of Miss Marjorie Liddell, the assets assigned to her would pass not to you, but to—" He paused. "Lucille March." Judith stood still. "As?" "That's right. It's not a formal document, but it has legal force, as it's signed and specifies the annexation of property in Hartwell. It was undoubtedly written long before the final will. But even so, since it's recorded in his own handwriting—" Judith finished the sentence for him. "Lucille had a clearer motive than we thought." Merriweather nodded ruefully. "And that potentially changes the course of the trial. Her defense could argue that the crime wasn't premeditated but accidental, based on a passionate motivation linked to a legacy she believed was lost." Judith sat down, absorbing the news. "And what do you think?" "I think even the dead keep changing the rules of the game. Alaric was like that. He always left hidden pieces, as if his life were an endless chess game." Judith closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Merriweather. We'll do the right thing. We always will." That night, Judith wrote a letter. Not to Poirot. Not to Merriweather. To Lucille March. "I can't and don't want to justify what you did, but now I understand what you feared. It wasn't poverty. It was insignificance. My mother died without anyone standing up for her. Liddell died without anyone believing her. And you're alive. I'll do everything in my power to ensure your process is fair. No more, no less. Not for you, for me." He signed with a single initial J. He didn't send it right away, but he left it on the desk. No envelope, no stamp. Like the truth when it doesn't want to hide anymore. The next morning, as he was walking through the portrait gallery, he stopped in front of one he hadn't noticed before, an unfinished painting, a barely outlined face, loose hair, featureless eyes, a blue dress faded by time. Judith touched the frame with her fingertips. Behind it, someone had written a single line in dry ink. Marianne, still faceless, still voiceless. Judith didn't cry. She didn't moan. She just spoke softly, as if the painting could hear her. I promise you that voice will come back. And as he left the gallery, he stopped in the hallway that led to the music room. He opened the door. He came in, and he played the melody again, this time without stopping at the crossed-out note. This time, complete. And although the garden was not yet in bloom, something in some invisible corner of the house began to breathe again. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Echo. The music room, despite its name, held more silences than notes. The walls, lined with maroon velvet, muffled the sounds, as if the architecture itself were ashamed to remember. Judith sat in front of the piano, where the framed score of Variations for Marianne. Resting on his music stand was a piece never completed by Sir Alaric, signed with a nervous stroke and deliberately left gaps between bars, as if someone had erased the most important notes before they could be born. The melody Judith had begun playing the night before still floated in the air, hanging between the gilded frames and the closed curtains. But this morning, something was different. As the second variation was played, a particular resonance vibrated beyond the piano, an echo. Judith stopped. The note reverberated around the room for a second longer than it should have, and not because of the acoustics. It was something else, something deeper, more structural. He looked up. The crystal chandelier hung motionless from the ceiling. No draught, no open door. And yet the echo remained. He pressed the same note again. An E-flat, the vibration again, more precise this time. No, it was echo. It was resonance. Judith stood up slowly. She walked to the right corner of the room, where a dark wooden console table rested against the wall. On its surface, a Chinese porcelain vase, a plaster figure, and an unwinding clock. Nothing seemed out of place, until Judith placed her hand on the console and felt the faint hum that lingered from the note. It just can't be. He touched the vase, and nothing. He touched the figure, and it vibrated weakly. He took it off. Below, a small indentation in the wood. Judith looked around as if someone could see her. No one. He pressed with his finger. A dry, barely audible click responded. And then, nothing. Wait. The silence thickened. The unwound clock struck a dead hour. The velvet seemed to absorb the light. Then, at the opposite end of the room, next to the music shelf, another click was heard. A mechanism. Judith quickly crossed the floor. The bottom panel of the bookcase had shifted forward only a couple of inches. He did not hesitate. He inserted his fingers into the gap, and with a slight tug, the panel opened, revealing a small chamber, no bigger than a safe, built into the wall. Inside, a lacquered wooden box, a yellowish paper envelope, and an object wrapped in black velvet. Judith took the envelope first. The ink was faded, but clear. For when the echo is louder than the silence. Inside, several folded sheets, written in Sir Alaric's unmistakable handwriting. He began to read, standing, without moving. If these words have been found, it is because I did not know how to protect what I should have. The silence wasn't an accident. It was an inheritance. My sister Marianne didn't die of fever, as was reported. She was silenced. For love. For shame. For cowardice. Judith trembled. I confess it here, not for redemption, which I do not deserve, but because the truth, like music, returns. Marianne was a mother, in secret. The child's father was a man who already had a family, title, and power. To avoid scandal, a move abroad was agreed upon, but Marianne refused to leave. She said music was her home, not exile. Then the agreement changed. The child was given up for adoption to another branch of the family, with new names, new silences. Marianne fell silent. Literally, she never sang again. He died 3 years later. Of sadness, I was 15, and I was a witness and an accomplice. Since then I've tried to write it down, but I couldn't, not with words, not with music. That's why I composed the variations, because music does not forget, and whoever deciphers that melody will find his true name. Judith dropped the paper. Velvet. With trembling hands, he unwrapped the object. It was a reliquary. Antique, silver, with hand-carved edges. Inside, a sepia photograph, a young woman with loose hair holding a child no more than 3 years old in her arms. Judith recognized the woman's face. It was the same one as the incomplete portrait in the gallery. The woman without a face, Marianne, and the child. Number it couldn't be, but it was. The eyes, the expression, the chin. He was the same one who appeared in the oldest family albums under the name Peter Carstairs, who believed himself to be Alaric's second cousin. Judith felt the pieces of an invisible puzzle begin to align. If Marianne was Peter's mother, and Peter was Peter's father. Lucille, South. Lucille March wasn't just a voice teacher bewildered by a missing will. She was a direct descendant of Marianne, of the woman who never had justice, the woman who was silenced. And without knowing it, Lucille had inherited not only a history, but an unhealed wound, an inheritance, an echo. Judith returned to her study without saying a word to anyone. She placed the locket and Alaric's letter in a locked box. That night, he called Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without ceremony, "I think I've found the truth, but not the one you were looking for." "Mademoiselle Carstairs," the detective's calm voice replied, "every truth that is born is a gift. What have you discovered?" "The why, not the how." There was silence on the other end. "And you want the world to know it?" "Number, not yet. It's not time yet." "Then listen to my advice. Keep it, but don't lock it away. Let him breathe in the music. Let it become melody." Judith smiled tiredly. "Thank you, sir. Good night, miss." Days later, when Bentley found Judith sitting at the piano playing the 7th variation, knew without words that something profound had changed. "Would you like me to bring you some tea, miss?" "No, Bentley, just listen." And he did. As the music flowed, free for the first time, the butler closed his eyes. Behind the notes, there was a voice, female, suave, Antigua. As if Marianne, the woman without a face, the woman without song, had finally returned. Chapter 11. The Tone That Wasn't His Own. Night fell like a thick sheet over Summerfield Chase, but the windows of the east wing glowed dimly. Lucille March's room was lit. No one else seemed to notice, except Poirot, who walked along the path outside with measured steps, as if every stone beneath his feet were part of an invisible score. I'd been watching for days, waiting for the silence to finally speak. And now, as he passed by the curtained window, he heard something. It wasn't a voice, nor music, nor wind. It was doubt, that kind of doubt that settles between notes. A blank measure. Lucille sat at the piano in her room, a more modest one than the large Bösendorfer in the main living room. The oil lamp flickered slightly, casting liquid shadows on the ceiling. In front of her was an old, barely legible piece of sheet music, stained with moisture along the margins. It was the same one I had found weeks ago in an uncatalogued box at the library. Variations for Marianne, Draft 2, signed by Alaric Carstairs, undated, undedicated. But there was something else. A small symbol in the bottom corner. an incomplete circle like a broken ring. Lucille ran her fingers over the paper, then over the keys. He started playing. The first variation, known, simple. The second, almost identical to the official version. The third, different, more somber, with an unexpected minor chord, as if Alaric had wanted to hide a dissonance in the midst of harmony. Lucille repeated the passage 3 times. Something was vibrating, not in the piano but in her, a memory, perhaps, a scene that he didn't experience, but that seemed his own. A blonde woman in a cream dress, singing at dusk as the garden ignited in oranges and ochres, a child in her arms, a man in the shadows, his fists clenched. Lucille stopped dead in her tracks. What is this? It wasn't his memory. It was another one. Implanted. Inheritance. Poirot went up to the east wing without announcing himself. He knocked softly, just once. Lucille didn't respond, but she wasn't surprised when she saw him come in. "I didn't think you knew how to get here, monsieur." "I can lose myself in many houses, mademoiselle," he said with a faint smile, "but never in those that contain a truth about to burst forth." Lucille took her hands off the piano. "What have you come for?" "Let's listen." She turned slowly, with eyes that looked like they had cried without tears. "Then listen to this," he said, placing his hands back on the keys. He played the third variation, slowly, precisely, with fingers that didn't tremble. Poirot closed his eyes. The music was elegant, nostalgic, and at the same time painful. When he finished, he didn't applaud, he didn't even move. "That part," he said finally, "isn't on any recording." Lucille nodded. "It's the unpublished version, a draft, the one they kept." "And why did they hide it?" She took a deep breath. "Because it contains the name." Poirot opened his eyes. "The name?" Lucille pointed to the score. In the third variation, the notes formed a recurring pattern. 3 notes, 1 pause, 4 notes, 1 pause. Listen again, it's a phonetic cipher. C-A-R, then pause, then S-T-A-I-R. Poirot approached. Carstairs. But not Alaric. The name doesn't continue with A-L-A-R-I-C. No, the pattern continues with M-A-R-I-A-N-N-E. Poirot felt a slight chill. A dual signature, a shared melody. Lucille lowered her voice as if she didn't want the walls to hear her. "My grandmother wasn't my grandmother. She was her sister, Marianne." "And how did you come to that conclusion?" Lucille stood up. She walked to her desk and took out an old, yellowed sheet of paper. A letter, unsigned, but true. Poirot read it silently. He recognized the words. It was the same confession Judith had mentioned. Marianne, a young mother, silenced. Her son surrendered. Her voice erased. "My father was that boy," Lucille said. "Peter Carstairs. Raised by another family with a different name. Adopted by the Carstairs of Lancashire, but with a silent allowance sent from this house." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And you knew since when?" "I didn't know. I sensed it. I always felt like Alaric's music spoke to me about something that wasn't mine. But that belonged to me. A nameless inheritance." Poirot left the letter on the piano. "So the reason for your return wasn't the will. It was the song." That same night, Judith Carstairs received an unexpected visitor. Lucille, without resentment, without masks. They both sat in the greenhouse with a single lamp lit. "I came to return this to you," Lucille said, handing him the locket. Judith looked at it but didn't take it. "It's yours." Lucille shook her head. "It's hers." They both knew who he was referring to. "So what are you going to do now?" Judith asked. "Nothing. I don't want land. No titles, no revenge. So why come back? Lucille looked at her with dignified sadness. Because every echo seeks to return to its origin, and that's who I am. A repeated note that needed to hear itself. Judith watched her in silence. And have you found what you came for? Not yet, but it's close. Lucille stood up. Can I ask you one last question? Of course. Lucille looked to the back, where the moon barely touched the bushes. Who taught you the variation that wasn't written? Judith smiled without answering. Lucille nodded. I imagined it. And he left. Poirot was walking through the garden when Bentley's figure emerged from the mist, as if he had been waiting. Have you discovered what you came for, monsieur? Poirot stopped beside the butler. Yes, but not everything has been said yet. Bentley nodded gravely. The truth never comes suddenly, does it? No, sir. It comes in layers, like dust on old sheet music. Poirot looked up at the sky. And now that we know his real name, we need to understand who wanted to silence him forever. Bentley narrowed his eyes. Do you think there was more than an inherited silence? Poirot placed a hand on the butler's shoulder. I don't think the real crime was murder. It was an omission. And as the rooms of Summerfield Chase fell silent again, a new melody began to take shape. One that had not yet been touched. A final variation. The one that would answer the only question that was missing. Chapter 12. The Inverted Note. Dawn lingered that morning. Clouds gathered like a thick curtain over the lawns of Summerfield Chase, plunging the house into an unreal gloom. Poirot, already carefully dressed since 6 o'clock, paced the corridors with his hands clasped behind his back, listening. Not for specific sounds, but for silences. The night had brought revelations, but like any good enigma, each answer opened a deeper passage, and at the heart of that labyrinth still throbbed a falsehood, something that didn't fit, a dissonance. When he reached the music room, he stopped in front of the Bösendorfer piano, closed, immaculate. Its black surface looked like an unopened coffin. He leaned slightly and pressed a single key, a sharp C. Too high. Poirot frowned. Lucille had retired early the night before, but she hadn't slept. On her nightstand, next to a lamp that had been lit all night, lay the score of the third variation. Her fingers were still scanning it, as if by doing so she could read a hidden truth among the notes. That cipher, Marianne's name, hidden in melodic intervals, wasn't simply a dedication. It was a cry, and yet why hadn't it been destroyed? Why had? Someone, instead of burning it, buried it among uncatalogued papers, hoping or fearing that it would be found. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Era Judith. Lucille stood up, tense. Yeah? Judith entered without waiting for an invitation. She didn't have the haughtiness of previous days, but rather a restrained, almost fragile expression. I need to talk to you, as a woman, not as an heiress, not as Carstairs. Lucille remained standing. Heard. Judith looked around as if afraid of hidden ears and carefully closed the door. What your father was, what Marianne suffered. We didn't know. Neither did Arabella, nor did I. Lucille looked down. Didn't they know, or didn't they want to know? Judith pressed her lips together. My mother, Arabella, had secrets, lots, but she was proud and stubborn. When that letter arrived, the first one you sent before you came, she panicked, not because of the content, but because it spoke of music. And what does that mean? That someone else had already warned him before? Lucille stared at her. Who? Judith didn't respond immediately. She walked toward the window, searching for the right phrase. Alaric. The silence that fell between them was absolute. That? Before she disappeared. Months before she died, Alaric and Arabella had an argument. I heard them. I didn't understand everything, but he said something like, "The melody will give you away, Arabella. Marianne isn't as dead as you think." Lucille felt her arms go cold. "And you never asked?" "I was 17. My father died the following year. The house fell into disrepair. Arabella became more withdrawn than ever. She forbade me from playing any unofficial Alaric compositions. She even removed several records from the library." Lucille nodded very slowly. So it was her. Arabella destroyed Marianne's memory. "I don't know if he destroyed it," Judith whispered, "but he did hide it, deliberately." Poirot, meanwhile, had retired to the library. There, Bentley was waiting for him, as always, with a tea tray and an inscrutable face. "Do you find everything in order this morning, monsieur?" the butler asked. "No, my friend, quite the opposite. I find everything exactly as someone intended it to appear ordered." Bentley tilted his head slightly. Poirot pointed to a leather-bound notebook. "This composition diary lacks the notes that should accompany the Marianne variation. There are no dates, no corrections, as if it were born finished. Maybe Alaric wrote it in one sitting. Or maybe someone removed the previous versions." Bentley remained silent. Poirot watched him closely. "Bentley, did you hear that variation played during Alaric's lifetime?" The butler hesitated. "Just once, at night. I was serving cognac in the saloon, and Alaric was playing, but he wasn't alone." Poirot approached. "Who was with him?" "Arabella, and a young man." "Young?" "Too young to be Alaric's friend. Maybe a student." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Do you remember anything else?" "Yes. When the piece was over, Alaric turned to Arabella and said, 'You wanted to bury her. I wrote her so she could live.'" Poirot spent the morning putting together pieces, loose details, wrong figures, omitted words. And at noon, he asked everyone to gather in the music room: Judith, Lucille, Bentley, and young Sophie, the silent librarian who hadn't said a word for days, but who had witnessed the archive searches, sat down, not knowing what to expect. Poirot stood in front of the piano. "My lord, monsieur," he began, "let me begin not with a deduction but with a confession. I don't know yet who lied, but I know for certain who heard the truth and held it as though it were someone else's." Silence fell. "This variation," he said, pointing to the score on the music stand, "was written by Alaric Carstairs not as a decorative piece, but as a testament, a trail of blood turned into music, a name hidden beneath notes, a coded story." Judith looked at Lucille with trembling eyes. "He knew," Poirot continued. "He knew that Marianne had been betrayed, that her son had been hidden, and he composed this as an antidote to forgetting." "But why didn't he say it out loud?" Sophie asked, breaking her silence for the first time. Poirot looked at her gently. "Because in this house, mademoiselle, words were dangerous. Music, on the other hand, went unnoticed." Lucille stepped forward. "And what am I then? A side note? An accidental refrain?" Poirot approached him. "You are the echo, and echoes are proof that something existed." Bentley raised an eyebrow. "So, monsieur, who wanted to silence this echo?" Poirot turned on his heels. "I don't know yet, but I do know one thing." He leaned over, opened the piano, and played a single note, a C sharp, again. This key is tuned a half step higher, deliberately, and that note is the key to the third variation. Whoever altered this key knew what to hide. There was an overwhelming silence. Poirot looked slowly at each face. The murderer isn't the one who killed, it's the one who tuned wrong. And then he added, in a lower voice, and now, at last, we are tuned for the truth. Chapter 13. The Shadow Tuner. Daylight filtered its presence timidly through the thick curtains of Summerfield Chase. It was as if the house itself were hesitating whether to wake up. After Poirot's revelation in the music room, the inhabitants of the mansion seemed to be carrying an invisible echo. The echo of a badly tuned note, which now resonated in every gesture, every pause. Poirot hadn't slept. He had barely retired to his room to collect his thoughts. He had spread out on the desk his black notebook, the one in which he never wrote more than necessary, names, dates, pauses. And in the center of the page, in capital letters, he had jotted down, "Who tuned the note?" At 9 o'clock sharp, he went down to the dining room. Only Bentley was waiting for him, as always, with the plates lined up with millimetric precision, the tea steamed, the toast whole. The butler barely bowed. "Did you sleep well, sir?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Sleeping well is a luxury reserved for the innocent, my friend." Bentley nodded without emotion. "Would you like something more than your usual breakfast?" "Yes," said Poirot gently. "I want the truth." There was a slight hesitation in the butler's fingers as he poured the tea, but he said nothing. Poirot watched him with restrained attention. "Tell me, Bentley, who had access to the piano in recent months?" Bentley stood tall, but his jawline hardened. "Everyone in the house, though hardly anyone had touched it since Arabella's death, except for Miss Judith sometimes, and Miss Lucille lately." "And you?" There was a pause. "Just to clean or close the lid. I never play music, monsieur." Poirot took a sip of tea. "And the tuner, how often did he come?" "Once a month. Mr. Carstairs was particular about that, but since his death no one has called." Poirot slowly put down his cup. "So someone here tampered with the tuning without professional assistance. And you didn't hear anything?" Bentley straightened up. "No, sir. And if I had, I would have reported it." Poirot nodded without another word, but his gaze never left the butler's impassive face. Mid-morning, Poirot asked to see Sophie in the library. The young librarian arrived with nervous steps. She was carrying a thin folder, marked in black ink, File P44. Her face, framed by an undone bun, looked like someone who had slept badly for many nights. "Monsieur Poirot." This appeared among the uncatalogued documents in the music room. I don't know how I didn't see it before. Poirot made her sit down with a friendly gesture and took the file. "What's in it?" Sophie swallowed. "Sketches. Old manuscripts. But one of them has a hidden dedication. It's written backward. It can only be read clearly if held up to a mirror." Poirot carefully opened the paper. The sheet, yellowed with age, showed a line of musical staves without a clear time signature, and at the bottom, scribbled in slanted handwriting, were some barely visible words. "To the one who was stolen from me, not in voice, but in shadow. Marianne." Poirot held her in silence for a few seconds. Then he looked at Sophie. "Who put this here?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but the folder was inside a box, sealed with a very intricate knot, like the ones Bentley uses when packing rare books." Poirot said nothing. His eyes glittered as if this single clue confirmed a previous suspicion. "Thank you, mademoiselle. That's been very helpful." When she left, Poirot returned to the mirror hanging over the fireplace. He held the score up to the glass. There, like an inverted revelation, appeared a series of letters written in the treble clef, M-A-R-I-A-N-N-E, with each letter linked to a specific note, a name hidden in shadows, not only in music, but in technique, a silent forgery. Later, Judith found Poirot in the greenhouse, examining an orchid that was not blooming. "Monsieur, do you think Marianne was murdered?" Poirot looked at her gravely. "No, mademoiselle." Marianne was silenced. Her murder was cultural, emotional. Her existence was erased without bloodshed. Judith sat down across from him. For the first time in days, her eyes looked truly tired. "There's something I haven't said. One night, years ago, I heard Arabella talking to herself. I was a child, but I hid behind the door." Poirot bowed slightly. "What did he say?" "He said, 'You got everything right, Bentley.'" "Even the timing." "But Alaric's ear, he'll hear it just the same." Poirot didn't reply immediately, but a muscle in his jaw tensed. "That confirms what I suspected." Judith looked at him, trembling. "What do you suspect?" Poirot stood up with the slowness of someone who has built a stack of cards and is now placing the last piece. That the false tuning wasn't recent. It was done years ago, as a warning, as a key, and Bentley was the instrument. That night, when everyone was already asleep, Poirot went down to the music room alone. He opened the piano. He gently plucked the string corresponding to the C sharp, and there, coiled among the metal threads, he found a splinter of wood, like a tuning stick, marked with 3 letters, ACR, Arabella Carstairs Richmond. The instrument, now yes, had begun to sing its secret. Poirot straightened up and murmured, "The tuning," was his confession, and the murderer, at last, had struck the first note of his downfall. Chapter 14. The String That Did Not Sound. Dawn arrived with a strange delicacy at Summerfield Chase, as if the sun itself hesitated to peek through the high windows of the mansion. The corridors, as silent as an abandoned temple, seemed to hold their breath. At that uncertain hour, Poirot had already returned from the music room and placed the splinter marked ACR on a silver platter on his desk. It wasn't just a physical piece. It was the first audible voice from the past. The Belgian detective paced back and forth across his room, his fingers interlaced behind his back, his mustache perfectly aligned, his gaze aglow with reflection. Each step seemed to contain an invisible compass, a countdown. He knew the time would soon come to gather everyone together, but not yet. Not until he understood the chord that hadn't been struck. It was then that someone knocked on the door. "Entrez," he said without stopping his pace. "Era Judith." "Sir, may I speak to you?" Poirot stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed to the chair in front of the desk. "Perfect. I was just about to call her." She entered, wrapped in a pearl-grey robe, her face pale, almost translucent. "I remembered something," he began. "Something about Marianne. Something I hadn't wanted to admit." Poirot sat opposite her, his brow slightly furrowed. "Speak without fear, mademoiselle. What is left unsaid weighs more than the crime." Judith looked down. "A week before she disappeared, Marianne showed me a small wooden box. Inside were 2 letters. She said they were from her mother, and that they proved she wasn't who everyone thought she was. She asked me to keep them, in case she didn't come back." "And he did it?" Judith nodded slowly. "I hid them in one of the secret compartments in Arabella's desk, the one under the second drawer on the side. But after that, I never wanted to see them again. I was afraid of what they contained." Poirot jumped up. His eyes shone with a mixture of gravity and compassion. "Mademoiselle, do you understand what this implies? Marianne knew, and she trusted you. What she held on to defined her. Was it defining her, or the others? Poirot did not reply immediately. That distinction, dear Judith, is the heart of the mystery. With the young woman's permission, they went downstairs to Arabella's office together. Judith opened the compartment with trembling fingers. The box was still there. It was made of oak, unmarked except for a tiny crack in one corner. Poirot took it with careful hands, like someone holding a long-exiled truth. Inside, the two letters were folded with almost ceremonial precision. On the back of both stood out an elegant, ancient script, Clarice. Poirot took one out and began to read it in a low voice. His eyebrows rose slightly. Clarice Carstairs, Arabella's mother. Judith held her breath. What does it say? Poirot looked up slowly. He says Clarice had an illegitimate daughter before she was married, that daughter was secretly given to a family in Dorset, that the child was named Marianne, and that Arabella knew about it. Judith brought a hand to her mouth. So they were, sisters. Poirot nodded solemnly. And she hid it. Arabella hid it, kept it quiet. Why? Out of shame? Out of fear of losing the inheritance, or something deeper, more unfathomable? Judith swallowed. Arabella spoke of music as if it were her blood. She said that some voices shouldn't mix with others. Poirot put the letter back. So silencing Marianne wasn't a mistake. It was a purpose. At noon, Poirot asked Bentley to accompany him to the greenhouse. The butler looked at him with an inscrutable expression, but obeyed. The greenhouse was deserted, save for the murmur of the fountains and the persistent whir of the fans. Monsieur Bentley, Poirot began, I want to talk about the tuning. The butler did not respond. I know you were the one who placed the splinter under the piano wire. I know you kept the manuscript box closed with your signature knot, and I know you heard Arabella's confession. Bentley for the first time looked down. I didn't know what to do. Marianne was good, brilliant, but invisible to this house. It wasn't my place to intervene. But he intervened. He tuned silently. The older man closed his eyes for a moment. I did it for her, so that something would remain. A dissonance, a mark. I couldn't protect her in life. At least I wanted to leave a trace. Poirot nodded gently. And why did he never speak? Because it was already late, and because the house has unforgiving ears. That evening, Sophie found Poirot in the music room. He was carrying a page he had just found between the folds of a Debussy book. Sir, I think this belongs to you, too. It was an untitled sheet, with a single musical line beginning with an empty measure, then isolated notes, suspended in silence, and at the bottom, an almost illegible inscription. What I didn't touch, what you didn't hear, because it was my voice. Poirot held the paper with both hands. The string that didn't sound, he murmured. Marianne left her silence here. In the darkness of his room that night, Poirot wrote 3 names in his notebook. Arabella, the blood that erased. Bentley, the shadow that refined. Marianne, the note that wasn't played, and below, a last line. Tomorrow I will show you the melody you built with lies. Chapter 15. The Last Bar. The hall clock struck 5 as Poirot stopped in front of the portrait of Arabella Carstairs. The oil painting was stark, executed with Victorian precision, but there was no softness in her eyes, no compassion in the curve of her lips. It was a portrait of silence, a portrait that stared unblinkingly. Poirot, standing under that gaze, felt as if he were looking at a broken score, a life's work that had stripped away the chords that didn't fit. Bentley passed by at that moment on his way to the dining room with the tea tray. His steps were precise, almost metrical. Poirot watched him out of the corner of his eye, like someone listening to a familiar echo. Every corner of Summerfield Chase seemed to contain not only history, but repetition. The score found among the pages of Debussy had now been placed in a makeshift display case above the piano. Sophie had framed it with a pale blue ribbon, and Judith gazed at it with reddened eyes, like someone confronted with a secret she finally dared to reveal. "It was her handwriting," Judith said softly. "I have no doubt. That was her handwriting. She wrote as if each note should survive time." Poirot leaned slightly over the frame. "It's not a finished song, it's an open measure, a suspended echo." "And what does that mean?" Poirot didn't reply. Instead, he walked over to the piano, lifted the lid, and played a single note, the very one that opened the score. A long, reverberating silence. "Listen, mademoiselle," he said then. "Listen not to what sounds, but to what is missing." Judith frowned. "Lack?" "Yes." Marianne composed not to fill, but to point out the gap. This melody doesn't exist to be performed, but to highlight an omission, a space that was denied. Judith paled and put a hand to her chest. Denied by whom? Poirot slowly covered the keys again, for all those who pretended not to hear her. That afternoon he called a meeting in the Golden Room. It wasn't yet the moment of final truth, but it was time to begin weaving the tapestry. The guests arrived one by one: Judith, Sophie, Bentley, even young Lionel, who had been absent for weeks among his music. They all sat in the semicircle Poirot had arranged in front of the closed piano. He remained standing, like a conductor before the first note. "My friends," he began softly, "for days I've been following a melody, an incomplete melody, not of notes, but of intentions." Silence. Marianne's disappearance wasn't an act of improvisation. It was an orchestration, a carefully rehearsed movement, and as in every great symphony, there were those who played, and those who remained silent, their faces tensed. Lionel shifted in his seat. Bentley looked down. Judith remained motionless, her fingers interlaced. "I've found letters," Poirot continued, "letters that prove that Marianne was the daughter of Clarice Carstairs, that is to say, Arabella's half-sister. Did you know that?" Judith shook her head. Sophie swallowed. "So that's why he treated her like a stranger?" he asked. Poirot nodded. Arabella believed in lineage, in control, and what couldn't be controlled was hidden. Marianne was too brilliant to be ignored, but not brilliant enough to be acknowledged. "My God," Lionel murmured. "The question isn't whether someone killed her," Poirot added, walking between the armchairs, "but whether everyone participated in her disappearance." Sophie looked at him in horror. "Are you saying it was a collective crime?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Aren't silences always like that?" After the meeting, Bentley stopped him in the hallway. "Monsieur Poirot, there's something else you must see." She led him to the attic, a place that hadn't been explored yet. At the far end, behind a curtain of dust and lamps covered with sheets, stood an old lectern. On it, a worn leather folder. Bentley opened it slowly. Inside, a single piece of music, no name, no dedication, but at the bottom, an inscription that chilled Poirot's blood. Tuned on the eve, let what was never allowed be heard. "The day before," Poirot murmured. "Of what?" "From the Last Supper where Marianne played for everyone." That evening, Poirot asked Judith to accompany him on the piano. "I want you to play this," he said, handing her the sheet music. Judith shuddered. "They?" "Yes. You're the only one who can do it without fear." She nodded, though her fingers were visibly shaking. When the first notes emerged, something changed in the atmosphere of the room. It wasn't melodic music. It was interrupted bars, unfinished phrases, silences placed with surgical precision, music that spoke of emptiness, of exclusion, of what was left out, of what was tuned so as not to be heard. Poirot closed his eyes. Every note was an accusation, every pause a suppressed cry. When she finished, Judith remained silent. Tears streamed down her cheeks. It was like she was still here. Poirot came over and put a hand on her shoulder. "It is, mademoiselle. It is in every note that was denied." Later, in his study, Poirot returned to his notebook. And beneath the list of names, he wrote one more sentence. "He who erases a voice does not eliminate the sound. He merely transfers it to the echo." The echo was about to explode. Chapter 16. The incomplete recital. Dawn of the next day arrived with a dense mist, as if the garden at Summerfield Chase had forgotten to breathe. The marble statues seemed paler than usual, and the air smelled of something suspended, like a high note that never quite dies. Poirot, now dressed in his grey linen suit, watched through the east wing window as Bentley entered with his usual silent gait. "Breakfast is served, sir." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He continued to stare into the mist. "Bentley, how long can a silence last before it breaks?" The butler hesitated. "Depends on who's listening, I guess." Poirot smiled sadly. That man, more than a servant, was already a score without a beat. He moved in precise intervals, as if he were afraid of making a noise. "You knew Marianne better than everyone here, didn't you?" Bentley nodded without looking up. "I watched her, monsieur. Listening, one can do it without being listened to." Poirot turned to him. "And the night of the recital. What did you hear?" Bentley frowned. "It wasn't what I heard." "But what wasn't heard?" "She played, yes, but not with all her might. There were bars missing from her performance, as if she refused to offer the ending." Poirot approached. "And who else noticed it?" "Arabella, the lady, noticed. I saw her expression. She knew Marianne was hiding something, and she didn't like it." Poirot nodded gravely. "Thanks, Bentley. That's enough for me. For now." In the library, Poirot found Sophie leafing through a photograph album. The images were all in black and white. Judith at 14, Lionel with his violin at 10, Marianne. In a corner of a sofa, with a faint smile. "I wasn't a happy child," Sophie murmured, noticing his presence, but not sad either, just isolated, as if she were always watching from the other side. Poirot sat down next to her. "And they never asked why?" "Arabella said it was an artistic temperament, that geniuses are like that. I wanted to get closer, but you couldn't cross the wall without tearing down everything else." Poirot pointed to a photo, Marianne sitting at the piano with Bentley in the background, half silhouetted by the shadow of the curtain. "Who took this?" "Arabella, definitely. She liked capturing moments, but only if she directed them." "And what happened to the camera?" "It's in your closet." "Why?" "Because sometimes a camera captures more than you want to show." That same afternoon, Poirot searched Arabella's wardrobe with Judith's permission. Inside, beneath shawls and perfumes from another era, he found the old bellows camera, still loaded with a half-used roll of film. Judith watched it from the doorway. "Do you think there's anything there?" "It's not a question of believing, mademoiselle. It's a question of trusting what people forget. Cameras, like mirrors, don't lie, except when asked." 2 hours later, in the improvised dark room Poirot had set up with Lionel's help, The images began to be developed. Most were formal portraits, dinners, meetings, rigid frames. But one last photograph, partially obscured by a double exposure, caught his attention. Marianne alone in the music room, in front of the piano. But she wasn't playing. She was putting something inside. Poirot leaned forward. An envelope that seemed to bear Arabella's stamp, but was torn at one corner. The position of her hands was precise, almost ritualistic, and the most curious thing, behind her, the living room mirror reflected Bentley, silent, watching. "Ah, Mademoiselle Marianne," whispered Poirot, "you left traces, in places where you knew no one would dare look." That night, he asked Judith to gather everyone in the music room. "Another meeting?" Sophie asked. "And this time, what do you want us to confess?" "Nothing yet, mademoiselle," replied Poirot. "I just want you to listen. One last time." Judith sat down at the piano. This time Poirot handed her a different score, a faithful copy of the one they'd found in the attic, but with added notes. Notes Poirot had deduced from Marianne's musical logic, strategic silences, truncated repetitions, modulations awaiting a resolution. "Did she write this?" "Number the Echo wrote it. I just heard it." Judith swallowed and began to play. The music was different this time, not because it was more beautiful, it was even more uncomfortable, but because it seemed to have a destiny, an end toward which it was moving resolutely. And as she reached the last bar, Judith stopped, frozen. "What is this?" Poirot, standing beside her, pointed to the final note. "A call, a name encoded in chords. Look at the progression. B, A, E, pause, D, then G, F." "That's not music," Lionel muttered, looking over his shoulder. "It's an anagram." "Exactly, monsieur," said Poirot. "Barnes, Clarice Carstairs' maiden name, the name Arabella had erased, and which Marianne wanted to remember." Sophie brought her hand to her mouth. Judith recoiled from the bench as if she'd stepped into a fire. "Good heavens," he muttered. "So all this time—" She composed not to be admired, but to leave a confession, a way to preserve a truth without saying it out loud. Because Marianne understood what Clarice never could, that there is no truth that can be hidden if one knows how to fine-tune silence. When everyone had left, Poirot remained alone at the piano. The keys were finally at peace. Not because they had spoken, but because no one could pretend they hadn't heard them. The resolution wasn't yet complete, but the echo was drawing closer. And in the shadows of the hall, as if she had never left, Marianne's presence seemed to throb, not like a ghost, but like a melody that had finally found its listeners. Chapter 17. The Key Under E Flat. That night, sleep was a guest who touched the doors but didn't enter. Judith walked barefoot down the south wing hallway, wrapped in a wool robe that had once belonged to her mother. The echo of her footsteps seemed to multiply between the walls as if other versions of herself were following her. In her mind, the coded melody kept spinning. Barnes, Clarice, Marianne, all pieces on a keyboard that no longer responded solely to her fingers. She stopped in front of the music room. The door, ajar, revealed the still open piano. A few drops of melted wax hung like dried tears from the chandelier. There was no wind. No one was there. Only the E flat on the left key, marked with a small ink stain. Judith played it. The sound was muffled, hollow, like a word that dares not speak. And then he felt it. A gap. Just below the key, on the inside frame of the piano. She carefully inserted her fingertips and pulled. The panel slid open with a dry creak. Inside, a small grey cloth bundle tied with a thin antique string. Judith's heart seemed to stop. "It just can't be." Poirot was awakened by the soft but insistent knocking. Judith was standing in the doorway of her room, the package in her hand, her eyes wide open as if she had just seen her childhood transformed into something else. It was there, under the E-flat, as if she knew I'd find it one day. Poirot, still in his dressing gown, ushered her in without a word. He lit the lamp, sat down at the table, and unrolled the cloth. Inside were two items, a rusty key and a sheet of paper folded in three, yellowed at the edges, written in pen in a handwriting that seemed to contain a heartbeat. Judith said nothing as Poirot read. He frowned, then raised an eyebrow. When he reached the end, he let out a sigh that wasn't one of relief, but of recognition. "What does it say?" she asked, as if the answer already lived in her chest. Poirot laid the paper on the table. "It's a letter. Signed Clarice Carstairs, addressed to Arabella. Never sent. Never read. Except perhaps by Marianne." Judith took it with trembling hands. The letter read, "Arabella, I never asked you to protect me, but you did it anyway. You took away my name, my memory, my right to say he was more than a mistake. You called me weak for loving him, but you were the one afraid anyone would know. Marianne was born of silence, and you wanted her to live there too. I can't stand it anymore. If one day she asks, tell her father had clean hands, that it wasn't a stain but a music I couldn't defend. You burned the certificate, Arabella, but you can't burn what sounds when she plays." Clarice Judith read it softly, as if each word should be absorbed by her body. "So, Marianne wasn't Clarice's secret. She was the victim of yours, Mother." Poirot nodded, his eyes fixed on the key. "And this key, mademoiselle, what does it belong to?" Judith looked at the shape, the curvature, the size. "It's one of the old keys. I think it's from the cupboard under the stone stairs in the library. It's always been locked. Arabella said it was only for storing old sheet music. Old scores, mademoiselle, are like unsent letters. They await ears that know how to read them." The cupboard creaked as it opened. Inside were folders arranged with red tape, some bearing names, Mozart, Debussy, Ravel. But at the back, amid the dust of decades, lay an unlabeled wooden box. Poirot lifted it carefully. Upon opening it, they found more scores. But they weren't copies. They were manuscripts, all signed with curly initials, C.C. Clarice Carstairs. Judith didn't need confirmation. She recognized the writing, the elegant arpeggios, the emotional modulations. Everything Arabella had silently disdained. She never wanted anyone to know that her sister also composed, that she had talent, and that that talent was free. Poirot examined one of the pieces. It was a sonata in 3 movements. The second movement had a dedication hidden among the notes, to the daughter I couldn't protect. Judith sat on the ground. She wasn't crying, she wasn't speaking, she just breathed like someone who'd just come out of the water. Poirot. Everything I learned was under the shadow of a lie. Non, mademoiselle. He learned it despite that shadow. His music is the continuation of a story that wouldn't be silenced. Hours later, well into the night, Poirot walked alone through the garden. Every path seemed to lead him to an imminent conclusion. The faces, the words, the pauses of everyone present now fit together differently. Lionel and his rage, Sophie and her fragile obedience, Judith with her wounded loyalty, Marianne, whose music screamed what no one dared to utter, Bentley, who had seen it all, and Arabella, whose silence was the oldest crime of all. Poirot closed his eyes, not because he was sleepy, but because he needed to hear. not the living, but those who still sang from the closed piano, from the mirror where Marianne disappeared every night, from the unmailed letter. There was almost enough. Just one more piece. A dissonance that still hadn't been resolved. That morning, he gathered everyone in the portrait room. Judith held the letter. Lionel, frowning, looked at Sophie as if searching for an argument. Bentley, imperturbable. No one spoke. Poirot placed Clarice's box of sheet music on the table. "Gentlemen, ladies, the time for silence is over." Sophie murmured, "Are you going to accuse someone?" Poirot shook his head. "Not yet, but I'm going to tell you a story. And you tell me if you recognize the melody." And it began, a simple narrative but full of rhythm, about two sisters, a secret, a daughter raised in the echo of a sacrifice, a hidden letter, an unaccepted piece of music, and one last note still suspended. When she finished, Judith approached the piano. "Poirot, may I?" He nodded, and she played. But this time it wasn't a piece by Marianne, nor one by Arabella. It was one by Clarice, from the second movement, the one with the dedication. As the last note sounded, everyone knew they were hearing not an end, but a threshold. Chapter 18. The Colour of the Veil. The floor lamp next to the divan cast a soft light on the blue silk-covered walls. The Saint-Fort's drawing room still retained that quality of elegant restraint, as if even crime had asked permission before crossing the threshold. Judith, sitting with her hands clasped, stared at the notebook Clarice had hidden for so many years. Beside her, Poirot stood perfectly still, like an ivory figure, studying every face present. Everyone had been summoned. Marianne, pale but firm. Madame Saint-Fort, her face as rigid as an antique portrait. Lucien Bentley, whom Poirot had personally brought from the notary's office that very afternoon, even the young waiter, Germain, who avoided everyone's gaze and played with the hem of his jacket. No one spoke. Poirot finally broke the silence. "My friends, we're here because, as always happens in life, hidden truths eventually rise to the surface. Miss Judith has made a discovery that changes everything we thought we knew about Clarice Saint-Fort's death." Marianne shifted slightly in her seat, but didn't speak. Madame Saint-Fort raised a hand to her mouth, as if sensing the fall of a veil carefully woven over decades. The hidden notebook, as well as the unsent letter, revealed that Clarice feared for her life. She feared someone she knew deeply, and they weren't unfounded fears. Clarice had received threats, yes, but not for money or jealousy. No, for something older, more essential, for her decision to speak out, to finally say who Marianne was. Lucien Bentley let out a sigh, but Poirot didn't look at him. "Yes," the detective continued, "Miss Marianne is Clarice's daughter, an illegitimate child conceived in her youth during a summer in Geneva. Clarice was sent away to hide the family's shame. The child was raised by others, and a veil of silence descended over the whole affair." Madame Saint-Fort jumped up. "That's not true. Clarice never—" Poirot interrupted her with a polite gesture. "Forgive me, madame, but the documents are authentic. Your daughter, in her final compositions, wrote clearly. The desire to protect Marianne, to finally bring her home, was what drove her to act. But that desire was dangerous for someone else, someone who lived under the assumption that the family fortune would fall to him." Poirot's gaze fell on Lucien Bentley. "Isn't that so, monsieur?" Lucien didn't respond. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Only the faint clicking of the clock marked the relentless passage of time. Poirot walked slowly to the centre of the room. Monsieur Bentley introduced himself as Clarice's cousin, a polite, charming man willing to help with the transition of the inheritance. But when he learned that Clarice planned to make her daughter's existence public, he realized he would lose all legal advantage. Marianne, as her direct heir, was taking away from him the future he had so carefully built. And then... "It wasn't like that," Lucienne burst out, standing up. "I didn't kill her. She refused to listen to me. I wanted to reason with her." "And what happened then?" asked Poirot gently. Lucien sank back into the armchair, his face covered in sweat. "We argued. I told her I couldn't do that it would destroy the family's reputation. She gave me that cold look, as if I were an intruder. She told me Marianne had a right to know, that she didn't care about the comments or the looks anymore, that she'd do it with or without my approval." Marianne, motionless, had her hands clenched in her lap. "And then," said Poirot, lowering his voice, "you offered her a cup of tea. Your cup, the very one Clarice used to accept from you with confidence, without any suspicion." Lucien raised his eyes, glassy. "I just wanted to scare her," he whispered. "A small dose. To make her faint. A warning. But I must have miscalculated. I didn't know she'd also taken her heart pills." Poirot nodded slightly. "A fatal combination. You yourself admitted it when you hurriedly cleaned the cup before the police arrived. But not enough." Miss Judith noticed that the cup wasn't part of the usual parlour set. It was smaller, more delicate. Like you, monsieur, she preferred not to leave obvious traces, but she forgot the eye of someone who notices the details. Judith looked down, a lump in her throat. Marianne, on the other hand, stood up. "So it was all about money?" she said, her voice trembling. "For an inheritance that wasn't even hers?" Lucien, now exhausted, didn't respond. The police led him out of the room minutes later. When silence returned, Poirot walked over to Marianne. His voice, for the first time that evening, was gentle. "Mademoiselle, I'm deeply sorry that this truth came to you so bitterly. But your mother wanted to protect you until the very end. Not with words, but with determination." Marianne nodded, her eyes red. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot then turned to Judith. "And you, mademoiselle, you have a formidable memory. Those little observations, those details everyone missed, were the key." Judith didn't respond. She just smiled weakly, as if the weight of the mystery had finally lifted from her shoulders. Poirot headed for the door. He took his hat elegantly, as if he had just finished a symphony. "Every crime, mes amis, no matter how perfect it may seem, has a crack within it, a crack through which logic and the little grey cells seep in." And with that comment, Hercule Poirot left, leaving behind a silent room and a truth finally unveiled.